So when you're wanting to use a custom texture inside of Max, the process is actually fairly straightforward, but it's useful to know what it is that you're trying to do and how you want that to map against what you're drawing inside of Max. I'm going to use a metal example. Maybe we're just going to model something that represents a simple piece of sheet metal in here. This could be an imported model from Inventor. I'm just going to draw it from scratch inside of Max. But the process is the same whether or not you're using imported geometry or native geometry. I've gone on the internet and downloaded a galvanized steel texture. And as part of that texture, I've got a number of different images to use inside of Max. If you're not used to these, it's difficult to sometimes understand what they are and what they're for. So all of these different images, if I just open them up inside of Photos, we have a color map. Our color map is going to tell Max what color we want the objects with this texture to be displayed. And as you expect, it looks like galvanized steel. And then we have the normal map. You can just about see, hopefully on the video, that this has got a kind of roughness to it here. So this will show where we've got lumps and bumps on the surface. It's an inverted in color. It's a little bit like a bump map, if you've heard of the term bump map before. But this is showing you the normal of the texture. Roughness is a very similar thing, but this is showing you the different roughness and the patterns that texture is going to show. Height map shows the highs and lows. It's a pretty flat piece of texture, but you can just about see there's some slightly lighter patches across there. Metallic is the shininess or the metallicness of the material, and so on and so forth. We're not going to use all of these, but this is what I've been given as part of my download. And to get a decent output in Max, I certainly want to use at least the normal and the color, if not the roughness as well. But we'll go through it and show you how to use it. So in a completely blank file, so I've just reset my Max scene, so it's a completely blank file. And all we're going to do is draw something that's going to represent a piece of sheet metal. So let's just use the box tool here, and we'll go ahead and just draw out a simple box shape. And with that box shape, let's just say that it's 100 mil in length, 50 mil in width, and it's a mil thick. And that'll do for the example I want to show you first of all. It's fairly straightforward, not overly complex at all. And what we'll do now is we'll press M on our keyboard for the material editor. I'm using the Slate material editor, which is pretty standard in Max now for, I want to say, the last maybe 10 years, 12 years. If you're using the compact material editor, the process is very similar, but the interface is slightly different. So Slate is what you want to use, really. And this gives you a load of materials on the left-hand side. Now, before we start playing around with those, it's important that we make sure our render engine is set correctly. So hit the little render setup here with the little teapot and cog, and make sure you're using the renderer that you want. I don't have V-Ray or anything like that installed, so I'm purely going to use Arnold for this example. But the materials that you use will link to the renderer that you use, so on and so forth. So I'm going to use an Arnold render, and for that I want to use the Arnold materials. So Max has some pretty good templates right off the bat. So we've got this physical material here, which will give us a fairly decent output, and actually comes with a load of finishes from a template perspective. So this is a good place to start if you don't have a starting point to work with, and you can come in and say, okay, well, we've got maybe some plastic or some wood or some paint, and we've also got some different pieces of metal down here. So this is a really good place to start if you don't already have a specific material that you want to use. But you can also use the search up here. And if we do a search for the word standard, we should find a standard material, which is a pretty, there we go, standard surface. Let's drag and drop that in. So we have this standard surface material, which is an Arnold material for a surface. We've got the same thing for volumes. We've got the same thing for hair, if you were using the hair and fur functionality inside of Max. And then you can see down here, we've got base color, the roughness, specular color and roughness, metalness, so on and so forth. And what you've got against this is the ability to select the material and give it a name. So I'm going to just call this Galv. And then you can either use the drop downs here and the menu on the right hand side. I like to use the interface over here. So against my base color, I can drag that out to the right, or sorry, to the left. And I can say that I want to use a map for that. And we want to use an image. We've got those images that we downloaded. So I'm going to come and choose bitmap here to say that I've downloaded an image. And this will allow me to pick up an image file. I've saved those particular files in my downloads, I think. So let me just browse to where they are stored. And I'm going to, in here, pick my color. From here, we can press open. This will link my color to the map. And if I just double click this globe here, you'll see that that has updated to give me a kind of image preview of what this thing will look like. If this had some transparency on, we can toggle on the background in that preview to show that transparency. It's also useful to toggle that on because it gives you an appreciation of color bleed and things like that when you're looking at reflection and refraction. But here we've got our color. I want whatever I build in this material to show up in my viewport. So I also want to make sure that this button here is on with the blue background, show shaded material in viewport. So I've added my base color. I'm going to add my roughness. So again, I'm going to choose general bitmap and choose my roughness map that I've got from the download. We've got a metalness. So I'm going to use my metallic map from the download for metalness. And every time you do this, you'll notice that the surface here is updating and changing. So let's come down and grab our normal map, general bitmap, and I'm going to grab my normal. There we go. And have I got any others that I want to use here? I don't think so. I don't really know if I want this metalness map on. Makes it look a little bit shiny. So I'm going to get rid of that one. So we've got the base color and the diffuse roughness, and then we're going to put on the normal map as well. And I'm quite happy with that to begin with. So there is my my material. And with that selected and with my component selected, I'm going to hit this button here. And what that'll do is it will assign the material to the selection. So that'll take this galvanized material and it will assign it to this selection here. So grab it, assign it to the selection, and then you can see that material within your viewport. You won't see all of the roughness or the bump map because they will only display when the thing is rendered. But it's going to start showing you, that the kind of color and the look and feel for that particular component. And if you want to start to get a quick handle on this, either I can do a quick production render, or I can actually start turning on things like active shade inside of Max. So if I use my standard viewport style here and use active shade, this will turn on the renderer inside of my viewport. So it will make your viewport a little bit slower. But with that, what you'll get is a rendered looking viewport, and you can start to get an idea without having to come up and down and hit render, render, render of what the material is going to look like, what the lighting is going to look like. And then you can go and have a play and have a look and tweak and adjust. And actually, to me, it's looking pretty good. We can see the color. The color looks okay. It's not the most amazingly rough thing, this piece of steel. It's still quite smooth. But should you want to change anything, you can just press M to bring up your slate editor. maybe we'll choose to change the normal and the roughness a little bit. So if we come to the roughness, we can whack that up to something like 0.5, 1 being the highest, 0 being the lowest. And we can then go and add the, what have we got down here? The normal map, which is towards the bottom. My scene is just updating the background. I should have turned the render engine off before doing so. And we have our, yep, the normal's there, that's fine. Okay, so we've whacked that up a little bit. If we zoom, we should start to see the fact that there's a little bit more roughness going on that surface. So I'm just going to turn that active shade off, but that's a really good way in which you can very quickly come in and get an appreciation of what that material is going to look like once it's rendered. The next thing you might want to do is add some lights to your scene, because it looks quite flat when it's rendered without any lights. So from here, I'm just going to go and add a very simple plain piece of geometry just to give me some floor. And I always like to give that a standard material just so it's going to render it. So I'm going to use this physical material example. I want to have something that's just a matte finish, and the color of that I want to be maybe a dark gray or something like that. Something that looks like that, and I'll just assign that to that selection. And then I'm going to go to create at the top. I'm going to choose lights. Again, I'm using Arnold as a renderer, so I want to use Arnold lighting. So I choose to create an Arnold light. I can place it in my scene, and then I can move it around to manipulate it. And I'm just going to place 1. Now again, once that's been added, we can go straight into active shade, and we can see what that light does instantly and what the light is doing to the scene. And this is all live, so I can start moving this up. It doesn't really matter how long you leave it to render. What you're doing is you're getting an appreciation of what's happening with that light as you move it around. And naturally, the closer it is to something, you're going to get a much smaller, more intense piece of light. The further away, you're going to get a much bigger but much softer piece of light. So what I want to do in this particular example is just drag this up above the component, maybe go to modify, and from here I want the light to be on for sure. You could make it targeted if you wanted to point the target in a different location. I don't need to do that for the purpose of this. We can choose what this light is, so I can say that it's a spotlight. I can say that it's a distant light. I can say that it's a cylindrical light. And what this does is it updates the general shape of the component itself to visualize it. But you can also see that it's giving me a much different result dependent on what it is that I select. So a quad light will give me a rectangular bulb, if you like, emitting rectangular light. A spotlight will give me a spot of light, as you would expect. So I actually want to have a quad light, so I do want it to be a square of light. We can change the spread and the resolution. I'm going to change the size of the light, so I'm going to say that this is approximately a 60 by 60 light, so quite a big a piece of light like what you have in your ceiling in a 600 grid, for example. And I'm going to place that roughly there. Again, I'm kind of doing this all by eye for the purpose of today, just kind of making it up as I go along to a certain degree. But that light, I've given it a bit of height so that it spreads nicely, and I've made it a bit bigger. Again, that's changed the dynamics of how that light is working. As well as that, I can choose to change like the roundness or the softness of the edges of that light. So if I change the softness to 0 rather than 1, it becomes much more flat. If I have it higher, the light becomes more soft and works really well. And again, that's a 0 to 1, 0 being hard, 1 being soft. We can make the light shape visible, which does nothing to the underside, but if I flip and look from the light from underneath, it will show me the light. So if you were rendering and wanted to see the light shape in your render, you can turn that on. We've then got some options with regards to the color. We can change the color of the light. We can change the Kelvin of the light. We can change the preset of the light. So we can come in and say that we want to have a 3200K I can't say that word, incandescent light, which makes it very warm. You can have a fluorescent daylight bulb. You can have a light white bulb, and you can choose these, or you can change your own. Again, choose what you would like based on the output that you're after. So if you know the bulbs that you use in reality for a good photo shoot, mimic those in here, either with the Kelvin temperature or with the color or with the texture. I'm going to leave mine with the default color and be happy with it. But again, have a look through the presets. You might find that one of those presets suits what you're after and give you the result that you need. The Xenon 6000 is pretty good. Intensity. The higher the intensity, the brighter the light. The lower the intensity, the softer the light. Exposure does the same thing. So if I go from 8 to 6, it becomes brighter. If I go from 6 to 8, it becomes brighter. 8 to 6, it becomes lower. So that's the exposure level, like what you would have on a digital camera. The higher the exposure, the brighter the image. And we can up the samples and the volume. The higher the samples, the slower the render, but the more realistic the light will look. Do you want it to cast shadows? Yes or no? And what's the density of those shadows and the color? And then we've got some camera-based options down here. Do you want to have specific diffuse levels? Do you want to have indirect illumination? All sorts of bits and pieces like that, which I'm just going to leave as default. And already what we have is something that's starting to look quite nice. We've got some soft shadows. The lighting is a little bit more realistic. It's still quite dim. So either you'd be adding a second light or upping the intensity of the light that we've got here. So maybe let's up it to 1.5. It's a bit washed out. Come down to 1.2. It's a little bit better. So this is all about having a play with the settings, finding something that works. What I like to do is build up almost like a rendering scene that works for a lot of different products. There's a video on YouTube that we've done where there is a studio ramp that we create, and then we put in a left, a right, a top, and a front light alongside a camera, which you can then use to start getting some realistic lighting. Get that to work with a product of a given size or scale, and then you can just use that scene as a template and drop more products into it. The next thing we need to do for the material is make sure that it scales properly or maps properly around the component. Because on the top face, this is looking really, really nice. But if I go back to a non-active shade view, like, it's just computing that render in the background. So let me just wait for it to finish. There we go. So if I just go back to a shaded view and look at the side, you'll notice you get all of these lines. That's Max not knowing how to wrap the texture around the component you've got. Because remember, what we basically have is a flat image that it's draped on top of that component. Now, if you have a seamless image, like we have here, it will be able to tile that component X amount of times, or that image X amount of times, and you won't see it. But what it won't do is know how to wrap it by default. So, this face is flat in this plane, whereas this face is vertical in this plane. So we use a modifier against our components called UVW map. And with UVW map, so long as it's something, fairly standard shaped, like a cylinder, a plane, a box, or a face, we can control with UVW map how that will work. If you've got something that's very aesthetically curved, you'll need to use unwrap to first unwrap that surface so that you can get the flat, put the texture on it in its flat form, and then wrap it back up. But UVW map, I'm going to change this to box because that best represents what we have down here. So we have a box, and then from here, with that box I've got the plane selected, my apologies. Let's select the box, let's select UVW map. The UVW map is on planar. I'm going to change it to box, and you'll see that we start to get different results based on what we select. So planar, box. And again, changing it to box, you'll see that it's now wrapping the texture around the side. So we've got the same texture on here as we do have on the top. Now, it's not going to be perfect at this point still, because you're not necessarily going to get a smooth wrap, because it's basically just placing the texture again on this face. Okay, so you have a texture placed on the top, and then that texture is also placed on the side. It's not necessarily wrapping it around here. If you're wanting to wrap it, then again, you need to look at unwrap UVW, which we'll look at in a second. But from the get-go, this is actually giving us something that's pretty good. It's looking okay. With that box, if we zoom out, you can see that it's put a pretty big box on here. I'm just going to click fit, which should fit the size of the box to the size of my my box over here. And then you can change the alignment to say what component you want to align it to. And then for each individual area, we can basically change how we want the texture to look. Again, this is quite it's a massive texture. It's a 4K texture. It's huge. And we're trying to squash that whole 4K texture onto a 1mm thick piece of metal. So it just looks squashed. But we can play around with this if we want to by eye and start, saying that it looks about like that. The other thing that we can do is tell Max that actually the texture should always be displayed full size, and it gives you a better job of scaling. But we can control this pretty nicely and get something that works quite well. From here, I'm just going to create a camera. So I'm going to say create camera. I'm going to create a target camera for the purpose of this that's just looking at our component. I'm going to put the target of the camera slightly above. If I can pick up my target. Thank you very much. I'm going to add my target and just have it looking at the top. I'm going to be looking down on this. I'm going to window with Alt and W. I'm going to window my views. I'm going to change this view back to my active shade and put it on my camera. And then I'm going to use these views here just to tweak and chop and change my camera so that it's looking at the product the way in which I want to look at the product. So I'm going to look at it down from that sort of angle. I'm going to move the camera back a little bit. So in the Y and the X, so I can see more of the product. Maybe up a little bit more, so we're looking a little bit further down on the product. Something like that is looking pretty good. I also want to change the perspective. So I would grab the camera itself. I would go to its modify properties. And from here, you can change the size of the lens. That's going to give you a zoom. You can change the field of view to change your perspective. Again, you've got stock lenses. You can change all sorts of options on here, like what you would do on an actual physical camera. And again, get this so that it's looking the way that you want and reacting the way that you want. Once you're happy, you can start looking at actually doing a production render. And your production render using Arnold should look very similar to what your active shade did. But because we were using active shade to get a good appreciation of how it's looking and what it's doing, we can then quite happily come in and say, okay, well, do you know what? I want to do a 4K render now of that using my production. And you know that although it might take a few seconds or a few minutes to go and produce that 4K output, you can do that knowing that it's going to be there or thereabouts. So do small renders or use active shade first to make sure you're happy with the look, the feel, how the texture's coming across, how your shadows are looking, and then go ahead and do a more high quality or a larger scale render, which will clearly take longer, but you should have to do less of them because you'll be more confident in what it is that it's creating. And there we have something that looks pretty good. It looks like a galvanized piece of steel. It's a little bit dark around the sides, so maybe I might want to just brighten those up a little bit as well. So I'm going to be a bit lazy. I'm going to go ahead and grab this this light that we used just here. I'm going to use my rotate command. I'm going to turn on angle snaps with A, and I'm just going to choose to copy. If I select my light, I'm going to choose to copy this light, and I'm going to place it behind the camera. So I'm going to have it facing my model, and I'm going to place it behind the camera lens. Again, remember to turn on your active shade if you've got the ability to do so using your the spec of your laptop. You'll be able to see how that's changing things. I'm now lighting up this area, so I've got no shadows in this area, and my shadows are all going to be on the back of my component here. Again, I'm now fairly confident that if I go and hit render, the front of our model is going to be much brighter, and we can see the texture coming through already on the front down here and down here. So really, in my mind, the key to getting realistic looking textures and realistic looking lighting, they kind of go hand in hand. You've got to get yourself a decent texture map that's not just a color of the image color. It needs to be a seamless diffuse map, which gives you the ability to tile that over a large area. You also want to use at least a normal map or a bump map or a roughness map, and all of those bits of information to be able to make this look like what it is that you're creating. Give yourself a background to work with rather than leaving it blank, because then you can cast shadows, you can change the material of this and start bringing some more realism to the scene. But use active shade, get yourself set up so that you can see what something is going to look like before you hit render, and then go ahead and render. If I take what we've done there and just add something with a little bit more detail, for example, like the Utah teapot, let's just turn on, where's my auto grid button? Okay, let's just place our, no, not a tube, teapot. Let's just choose to place a teapot here, and I'm going to place a Utah teapot on top of our piece of galvanized steel, like so. I'm going to rotate that round in the axis here, so there's a bit more going on. Let's also just move it a little bit closer to the camera as well, about there. Fantastic. And then with this one, let's go and do the same thing. So let's go into our material slate editor, and then with the slate editor this time, I'm going to completely flip reverse it. So I'm going to grab this blank material, and I'm going to assign the blank material to our piece of metal here. I'm going to select the teapot and say that teapot is now made from galvanized steel. The teapot itself, I'm going to go to its modify panel, and I'm just going to round off the radius and give it many more segments, just so it's nice and smooth. And then from there, I'm going to say that it looks pretty good. I mean, it's done a pretty good job of the mapping without having to use UVW map or unwrap. But again, go ahead, add your texture on, use UVW map to get it to wrap correctly around the component so it doesn't look stretched around any of the positions. Check out unwrap UVW if you need to. That's particularly good for very smooth and very curved faces. Add lights around your component to lighten it up, and within not too long a time you should be able to get to a point where you're creating fairly good looking renders within a few minutes. It's just all about spending some time finding the right materials, using the right lights, spending a little bit of time tweaking and adjusting to get something that suits. Once you've got that, go ahead and render it. And if I go back to using my piece of metal as galvanized, I'm going to duplicate my physical material here and make a nice satin orange paint teapot. I'll just use the out of the box texture for that, and we'll apply that to our Utah teapot. Again, I'll just use Arnold to get appreciation of what that looks like. Looking pretty good, fairly happy with it. Hit render. I hope that helps some of you learn to use your own textures inside of Max. It's got some fairly good textures out of the box. But when you start using your own, you get a much better result because you can control it. I hope that helps. Hope it's been interesting. Until next time, take care, and we'll see you soon.